Lost and Abandoned Oil and Gas Wells, brought to you by SaveOurStreamsPA.org. Join the hunt. On November 1st, 2011, SaveOurStreamsPA.org kicked off a scavenger hunt for Pennsylvania's lost and abandoned oil and gas wells. The purpose of the hunt is to locate, promote awareness, and plugging of the wells by photographing and obtaining their GPS locations, and to put that information we gather into a Google map that will be easily accessible for online viewing. There's a long history of petroleum use in the world. Evidence shows that the first oil wells are believed to have been drilled in China as long ago as 350 AD. These early wells were drilled as deep as 800 feet using rudimentary drilling bits attached to bamboo poles. The oil itself was burned off to evaporate brine for the production of salt. By the 10th century, the Chinese had even been building bamboo pipelines to transport the oil from their wells to salt springs where the brine would be collected. Early petroleum use in Pennsylvania, Oil Creek, ancient oil pits. Well before Anglo settlers arrived in the area of Oil City, PA, the area around Oil Creek had been settled by the Seneca Nation by the early 1600s. And the Seneca discovered oil pits cribbed with wood, some 20 to 30 feet deep. Many ancient oil pits have been discovered between Oil City and Titusville. Researchers believe these pits may have been dug by the mound builders. The Seneca harvested this oil, used it in ceremonies. The oil was collected by the Seneca tribe by placing blankets in the creek to absorb the oil, and by skimming, and also by lining long trenches with wood. This oil was prized and was a culturally significant resource to the Seneca. The earlier uses of oil are detailed in a book published in 1865 titled Petroleum and Petroleum Wells by a J.H.A. Bone. He writes, in the year 1845, Mr. Lewis Peterson, Sr. of Tarentum in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, brought to the Hope Cotton Factory at Pittsburgh a sample in a bottle of what is now known as petroleum. Mr. Peterson reported it came up with salt water from his salt well at Tarentum, and it gave him considerable trouble. When combined with sperm oil, it was used as a lubricator for the finest cotton spindles. By 1859, the first commercial oil well was drilled near Titusville, Pennsylvania. On the first day of its operation, August 27th, Edwin Drake's well had produced 25 barrels of oil from a depth of 69 feet. And from the 7th report on the oil and gas fields of western Pennsylvania from 1887 and 1888, little more than 29 years have passed since the first oil well was struck in Pennsylvania. Already about 58,000 wells have been sunk, and as they are scattered over every part of western Pennsylvania, to a depth of several thousand feet has been obtained. Gas exploration was also becoming more and more common. According to Charles A. Ashburner, who was a geologist with the Pennsylvania Survey in the late 1800s, the first gas well in America was drilled in Fredonia in Chautauqua County, New York in 1821. By 1889, there were 999 gas wells in Pennsylvania, and by the end of 1903, there were 5,915 recorded gas wells in Pennsylvania alone. In Pennsylvania, oil and gas well construction and abandonment is regulated by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Office of Oil and Gas Management. The management and plugging requirements of oil and gas wells has changed through the years. In the 1890s, legislation was designed to protect oil-producing formations from flooding by freshwater. In 1921, legislation specified methods for pulling casings and plugging wells. And in 1956, legislation required gas wells to be permitted so that their locations could be coordinated with underground coal mining operations to assure the safety of coal miners. In 1984, Pennsylvania signed into law the Oil and Gas Act. This act defined an abandoned well as any well that had not been in production by its operator in the past year, or any well that was not completed for production within 60 days of having been drilled. The 1984 Oil and Gas Act also provided for funds to be placed into a revenue account to be used by the Pennsylvania DEP to plug abandoned wells. This fund receives revenues from fines, fees, penalties, and surcharges on all oil and gas well drilling permits. With the passage of the Oil and Gas Act in 1984, any wells drilled in Pennsylvania after April 17, 1985, were required to be bonded. This bond is intended as a financial incentive to ensure that the operator will adequately perform the drilling operations, address any water supply problems the drilling activity may cause, reclaim the well site, and properly plug the well upon abandonment. The bond amount established for a single well was $2,500, or a blanket bond could be placed to cover any number of wells drilled in Pennsylvania. That bond was established at $25,000. Act 78 of 1992 established an orphan well plugging program. Orphan wells are a subclass of abandoned wells. These are wells that were abandoned prior to April 18, 1985, wells that have not been affected or operated by the present owner or operator, and the present owner, operator, or leasee has received no economic benefit. The $50 surcharge previously placed into the abandoned well restricted revenue account was placed into a newly created abandoned well plugging fund, which also received revenues from the $100 surcharge on new oil wells and $200 surcharge on new gas wells. According to the Oil and Gas Act, which was signed into law in December of 1984 and became effective April 18, 1985, the well plugging funds generated about $300,000 per year. If the $90,000 generated from surcharges, permit fees, penalties, and bond forfeitures were added to the plugging funds, total revenues of about $390,000 per year could be expected. At that level of funding, it would take more than 160 years to plug the currently identified orphan wells. If all those funds were used to only plug the 550 presently identified problem wells, it would still take 28 years to complete the $12 million worth of work. In 2012, Act 13 was passed, which increased the required permit application fees. These now range from $250 to $3,000 based on well bore length. The required plugging bond for oil and gas wells has also been increased under Act 13. Bonding for deep shale wells is currently set on a sliding scale according to the number of wells an operator drills and the depth of each well. Yet this bond requirement is still only a fraction of the estimated cost to plug. According to a Carnegie Mellon University study titled Economic Incentives and Regulatory Framework for Shale Gas Well Site Reclamation in Pennsylvania, which was authored by Austin Mitchell and Elizabeth Kastman, Pennsylvania currently requires production companies to post a bond to ensure environmental reclamation of abandoned well sites. But the size of the bond covers only a small fraction of the site reclamation costs. The economics of shale gas development favor transfer of assets from large entities to smaller ones, and with the assets go the liabilities. Without a mechanism to prevent the new owners from assuming reclamation liabilities that are beyond their means, the economics favor a default on well plugging and site restoration obligations. According to the same Carnegie Mellon University study, The estimated cost to plug a Marcellus shale well will be in the vicinity of $100,000. This study also states, however, in some cases, the costs for plugging and abandonment of a shale gas well in Pennsylvania have been substantially higher. This study cites, for instance, in 2010, Cabot Oil and Gas Corporation estimated that it spent $2,190,000 to properly abandon 3 vertical Marcellus shale gas wells in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. That averaged out to about $700,000 per well. There have been an unknown number of oil and gas wells drilled in Pennsylvania since 1859. The Independent Petroleum Association of America estimated that approximately 325,000 wells have been drilled. In 2012, a DEP official stated the exact number of abandoned wells in Pennsylvania are unknown. A broad estimate is that there have been between 300,000 and 500,000 wells drilled in this state. The Pennsylvania DEP has records on approximately 141,000 wells. They estimate that 88,300 of those wells are still operating. Another 44,700 of those wells have been plugged. That leaves, according to the Pennsylvania DEP records, 8,600 orphaned and abandoned wells. The remainder of those wells, estimated between 184,000 and 359,000, are lost. At the current rate of well plugging, it could take several centuries to locate and properly plug all of the lost, orphaned, and abandoned oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania. Even a plugged well is no guarantee. Many older wells have been plugged with pine trees or other materials that will deteriorate over time. Even proper well plugs done with cement will shrink, crack, and deteriorate over long periods. Many of these have already failed. Lost, orphaned, and abandoned oil and gas wells, especially unplugged or improperly plugged wells, are one of the most effective pathways for methane and other contaminants to migrate into groundwater, surface water, and the environment. And as a well's casing deteriorates with age, the risk of methane migration into the aquifer that well intersects increases. Although many wells have been long forgotten and may never cause problems, others are known to cause health, safety, or environmental problems, especially in areas where new development is actively underway. In the 1990s in McCain County, the Pennsylvania DEP responded to a complaint of gas escaping from an abandoned gas well located in a wooded area near the Footrest Campground. During their investigation, it was discovered that an extremely large amount, estimated at more than 100 million cubic feet per day, of methane was venting from this abandoned gas well. The old well became reactivated when fracking was completed on a new gas well that was approximately 4,000 feet away. One of Pennsylvania's worst cases of gas migration occurred in Versailles, Allegheny County. More than 175 gas wells had been drilled in that town between 1919 through 1921. In the 60s, pockets of gas began leaking into homes. Some homes were condemned, others had to be demolished. In July of 2008, on Tin Town Road in Monroe Township, Clarion County, fugitive gas began migrating from a very old gas well that had been drilled in the early 1900s. This gas migrated through a septic system and entered the bathroom of a residence. When the resident attempted to light a candle, the resultant explosion fatally wounded that resident. In McKean County, PA, near the city of Bradford, a home exploded near an active drilling site. Subsequently, the DEP ordered the owner-operator to plug 3 abandoned wells that were discovered during the investigation in the house explosion. Safety issues arise, especially when lost, abandoned, orphaned, and poorly maintained and improperly plugged wells are located within close proximity to construction, excavation, drilling, and hydrofracking. Current standards ensure that oil and gas wells are constructed and plugged under improved guidelines, but many earlier gas and oil wells had inferior or improper linings, with the earliest wells being lined with wood. It is always best to err on the side of caution. Well hunters and landowners should assume that any historic well found has not been properly sealed or permanently plugged, with the exception of wells that have monuments clearly identifying them as plugged wells. Locating old, lost, and abandoned wells. What to look for. Older wells generally have uncemented steel casings. Newer wells usually have steel casings that are cemented. Very old oil wells may have wooden liners. You can start searching for old and abandoned wells by searching through the United States Geological Survey, topographical maps, or historical books that are available online at your local historical society or library. You'll look for lost wells in old land deeds, property surveys, land transfer documents, and insurance plans. Look for signs of historic oil and gas exploration while hiking, sightseeing, fishing, hunting, geocaching, or any other outdoor activity. It is not unusual to find wells located in streams, low-lying areas, and wetlands. Historic wells can be found just about anywhere in Pennsylvania's oil and gas region. Look for areas with old pipes laying on the ground. Stream beds may also offer some clues for locating old oil and gas fields. Look for any metal or wooden debris that might indicate a well may be near. Look for piping or casing materials or covers that may conceal a well. Do not move any material that may be covering an old well, as the ground nearby may be unstable and could possibly collapse. You should also look for pump houses, old compressor stations, oil spills, and outbuildings. Historic wells can also be found along access trails, old roads, or anywhere where you may see old drilling equipment. Look for older tanks and pump jacks. Old and historic wells and well casings can also be camouflaged by overgrown vegetation. If you find a well and you are unsure of that well's status, it's important to remember that Pennsylvania requires every active operating well to display the registration number granted by DEP in a conspicuous manner on the well. There are active operating wells that are missing this information. There are also many intact abandoned wells. There are also operating wells for which the DEP is unaware. These wells and their GPS locations should be reported to the Pennsylvania DEP. Remember that methane is odorless and combustible. Many lost, abandoned, leaking, and unplugged wells will have an odor, but many wells that are expelling methane will have no odor at all. Many of the estimated 184,000 to 359,000 lost wells in Pennsylvania, and many of the approximately 8,000 wells that are on the Pennsylvania DEP's orphan and abandoned list, have been leaking methane into the atmosphere for decades. Methane is the main component of natural gas. Left unplugged, these wells needlessly contribute greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, affecting climate change. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, methane is a greenhouse gas that remains active in the atmosphere for approximately 9 to 15 years, and methane is over 20 times more effective in trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Please report all wells that are contaminating the air and surrounding environment to the National Response Center. The National Response Center, NRC, is the sole federal point of contact for reporting oil and chemical spills. If you have a spill or a leaking well to report, please contact the NRC at 800-424-8802. The purpose of the scavenger hunt for lost wells is to locate, photograph, and obtain GPS coordinates for these wells, and to place that information in an online map. Also, to raise awareness and to call upon the landowners, industry, developers, and our government to recognize the impact these wells are having on the environment, water sources, and the many hazards posed by these wells, and to plug them adequately. Please visit our website at www.saveourstreamspa.org to learn how you can join the scavenger hunt for lost and abandoned wells. If you would like to contribute to our Save Our Streams PA scavenger hunt for lost and abandoned well map, please send your photos with location information to saveourstreamspa@gmail.com with the subject line, Found Well. Thank you for taking the time to view this presentation. Please contact us with any suggestions you may have. Your suggestions are always welcome. Visit us on our Facebook wall, and we will update you as our search progresses. Save Our Streams PA.